Welcome to Aquarian Diary, where we discuss issues around the emerging age of Aquarius. I'm your host, John Irving. Thank you for joining me. Greetings all, it is July 26th, 2022. I read something a few days ago that was like the missing piece of a puzzle for me. I have often wondered why socially conservative people or religious people are so obsessed with controlling or limiting the sexual behavior of other people, and why they would be opposed to things like LGBTQ rights, access to abortion, access to contraception, and those kinds of things, because it never made rational sense to me. A glaring example would be the great concern about women not having abortions because they care about the fetus. But then when the baby is born, they're not willing to give any level of support to the child or the single mother, and they're left to kind of fend for themselves in a dog-eat-dog world. They just basically don't care about the child after it's born. So if you say you care about the life of the child, but that you don't actually care about the life of the child, there's something seriously wrong with your argument, or your belief, or your position. Now, people of faith, quote-unquote faith, are willing to overlook a lot of contradictions and logical fallacies on the basis of their faith, but that requires setting aside reason. Now, I have always assumed that it was some kind of a patriarchal thing, where men wanted to control women so that they wouldn't stray or cheat on them. These are men who would have been weak or insecure about their sexual prowess or desirability, and so you create these complex social structures and ideologies or religions which basically control or limit the freedom for women to engage in sexual activity with other men or other partners, going so far as to punish them severely in some cases if they go beyond those arbitrary or artificial boundaries. Hell, guilt trips, and all that crap. So I always recognized that it was a way of controlling women, but that still didn't completely explain it for me. And women would also benefit to some degree by controlling the actions of their male partner so that he wouldn't necessarily stray, although there's a lot of cases where men are allowed to have multiple female partners, but almost never the reverse. So there seemed to be a bias towards men, which is unsurprising, given how patriarchal the world is. So then a few days ago, I read this absolutely remarkable theory put forward by two professors of psychology that basically suggests that the reason conservatives or social conservatives are so obsessed with other people's sexual activity is because people who express sexual freedom pose a threat to people who are sexually restricted. That is, there are people who believe that sexuality and sexual expression should be limited and strictly controlled, and there are people who don't. And so the sexually restricted people would be the ones in this case who are threatened by people who are more sexually liberated. I'm not advocating either case here, I'm just trying to make a point. Just to paint the picture, people who are sexually restricted are threatened by the sexually liberated expression of other people because they might come between them and their partner, or husband, or wife. And so, by doing things like making abortion expensive, in the sense that it's difficult to get an abortion, or even further difficult to get things like contraception or the morning after pill, you're making sexually liberated activity more difficult and challenging. And that in turn gives you a greater sense of security because your marriage, let's say, is less likely to be threatened by someone who might come along and have sexual relations with your partner. and damage or break up your relationship, which you are very invested in. The authors go so far as to state that making contraception more difficult to obtain would fit right in with this agenda as well, because that also makes it harder for people to engage in sex, casually or without consequence. Because these people perceive things like homosexuality and the use of drugs as being linked with promiscuity, they are against things like drugs and homosexual behavior as well. It's important to keep in mind that these potential competitive threats for people aren't necessarily explicitly identified, and therefore it could be anyone within society or the world that one might have to be concerned about. Complete strangers, in other words, are feared. Now, personally, I could speculate that this would also be why they are against sexual education, or liberal or progressive sexual education, and even possibly things like public education as a result. That it all comes back to sex and their sexual insecurity. The general theory is that the harder it is to have sex openly outside of a committed relationship, the more secure these people are that their relationship that they're invested in is not likely to be threatened. It's a strategy rooted in paranoia. From their perspective, a woman who needs an abortion deserves it for not being sexually inhibited. Even better, let's make abortions illegal, and now she'll really suffer for being promiscuous. She'll think twice before doing that again. They also state that being conservative is associated with people who are married and have children more so than just age. So when people get into a committed relationship, especially if it involves intentional procreation, these kinds of issues suddenly take on a greater importance to them. There is this widely held belief that people become more conservative as they age, when in fact, for many people, the actual trigger might be being married and procreating. By the same logic, presumably there would be a bias against single people as well. In addition, and even more remarkable, if that's possible, is that they state that religiosity is less of a driver than being sexually restricted. So people who are sexually restricted often become religious as a means of protecting their relationship and minimizing threats to their relationship. I'm going to obviously provide a link to this. It'll be in the description below. But this is the missing link in a lot of things. Like, consider the implications that a lot of people engage in socially conservative religious activities or religiosity as a means of gaining security from other people who they perceive as sexual threats or competitors to them. So in effect, it is a self-preservation mechanism, and it is a selfishly based or oriented strategy. It is not based on religious piety, purity, or empathy, as is often falsely claimed. They are willing to limit other people's freedoms to give themselves a greater sense of security. It's really kind of twisted, but it makes a lot of sense. So now, why is this important? Because in order to really speak to somebody or address them, you need to understand their core motivations. In fact, I was reading something earlier which brought me back to this article, which I had read several days ago, and I've been meaning to do a little talk about this here. So earlier today, I was reading another article in the Washington Post about this huge thing that's going on in Nebraska where people are up in arms about sexual education, which all of the social science evidence suggests that a good sexual education actually minimizes harm to young people and protects them from predators, whereas a lot of these conservative people in Nebraska are basically saying that this opens the door to people being groomed, which just doesn't really make any sense. But it's a huge issue there. And it brought me back to this thing about, like, why are conservatives so friggin' obsessed with other people's sexual activity? Because, like, from my perspective, who cares? You know, people can go do whatever the hell they want in the privacy of their own bedroom, assuming they're consenting adults. Like, what possible difference could it make to anybody? It never made sense to me. And on the abortion thing, I'm always kind of like, well, if you don't want to have an abortion, don't have an abortion. Big deal. But why would you need to interfere with other people's rights as to whether or not they choose to have an abortion? And the same thing with religiosity as well. Why are people so obsessed with cramming their religious ideology down the throats of other people? And, you know, they want to actually make a theocracy, which is, like, most people would just find that, like, extremely disturbing. In fact, the arch nemesis of conservative Republicans is Iran. Iran is a theocracy. Another example would be the Taliban. The hypocrisy could not be more profound. So, what is behind this desire to control other people? And it all comes back to insecurity. It's very immature, but this sort of whole theory ties together a whole bunch of things that for me haven't made sense. And I've thought about this a lot at various times, and especially since Roe v. Wade was overturned. Just consider, like I said, that this is all about self-preservation. It's ego. It's egoically centered activity, basically. I'm going to stop you doing things that I don't like you doing because what you're doing threatens the security of my relationship. Potentially, hypothetically, theoretically, maybe, maybe not. But just in case, we're going to limit the freedoms and self-expression of hundreds of millions of people because I'm insecure. What do people do often when they love somebody? They want to control them. This possessiveness kind of can take over, where you want to control or limit someone else's behavior so that they won't leave you or upset you or disturb you or whatever. That's all egoically based, right? So anyway, absolutely fascinating article which ties together a lot of loose ends and provides a missing piece to the puzzle that I think makes a lot of sense and explains all of this irrational and bizarre, creepy and disturbing behavior that we're witnessing on the part of the right. I have extrapolated a lot here, but if you go and read the report, I think you'll see the same thing that I see. Now, just for the record, I am not anti-monogamy. I'm actually a monogamist myself. But if somebody else wasn't, it wouldn't bother me at all. I don't really care. If it's important to me to be monogamous, I will find somebody else who also wants to be monogamous. And if I don't choose wisely, or choose somebody that I can't really trust, that's my own problem. That's my own fault. That's my own naivete, or whatever the case may be. Society as a whole should not be punished because I'm incapable of picking a partner that has the same beliefs and values that I have, or because I pick partners that I can't trust and that I need some form of external control to coerce them into behavior that will pacify me. Of course, everyone has felt jealous or insecure probably at one time or another, so we can all empathize with that. But that doesn't justify endorsing institutions and political and social movements that aim to strip away rights and privileges from vast numbers of people who do not share your ideological or religious worldview, or to impose, for example, Christo-fascist theocracy on everyone. I can virtually guarantee you that the further we get into the age of Aquarius, the less likely people are to put up with dogmatic and irrational paradigms, which force them to behave in ways that don't actually resonate with their own inner truth. Since I brought up the term paradigm, which is actually probably my favorite word, I heard it misused recently by somebody on another channel. And I want to make sure that people understand that a paradigm is an all-encompassing set of beliefs that create like a lens through which we perceive and interact with reality. It is not a subset of ideas or a portion of our beliefs, but the entire framework itself, holistically, which, like I said, is the filter through which we perceive and interact with reality. Often, we are not entirely conscious of this framework because it involves a lot of assumptions and things that we have been taught or programmed to believe, as well as our subconscious. I hope that makes sense. Because I don't want to see the word misused to the point where it loses its meaning. It's such a great word. Again, the link will be in the description below. The conversation, by the way, where it's published, it's a very good site and it has high content standards. And it's one of the sites I check fairly frequently because they do often publish stuff that is really interesting. It's basically a platform for academics to comment on their own research directly to the public. Oh, and by the way, I have been posting some articles that I think are really interesting in the community section of my YouTube channel. Not a lot of people seem to engage with that, but some stuff I find very interesting, and I'm putting a few comments with some links in the community tab of my YouTube channel. And if you're interested in this stuff, please check it out because there's some, I think, interesting and important stuff there. I'm not exactly sure how much I should use that because I don't want to overwhelm people and lose subscribers or something like that. But it is kind of a way for us to talk about some of these things. Also, please share this information if you find it interesting with other people. I think it's very important for us to understand what is actually happening in the world. You know, there's a lot of things that are happening that just they don't make rational sense. We need to figure it out. That's part of how we're going to deal with some of these things, is by coming to a true understanding of them and not just having a vague sense or understanding about what is actually occurring. And I will also add that I shared a link on my community section to a free ebook called The Authoritarians, which was written by an expert on this subject, and it goes into detail and explanation about the behavior of the authoritarian personality type, which is a fairly significant portion of the population. And I think it's really helpful to understand what motivates them and why they act the way they do and what they're capable of, which is actually quite disturbing. Because if you're an empathic or compassionate person, it can be extremely difficult to kind of grasp or wrap your head around why certain people act the way they do. Like, why would somebody want to harm somebody else and get off on it even? Well, there's some explanations for that. And why would certain people support authoritarian type leaders who are obviously corrupt, inept, and often not very evidence-based or reality-based, or even necessarily intelligent? There's explanations for that too. I have made the case here and elsewhere that I believe that what is occurring in the world right now with this trend towards authoritarianism and fascism represents an existential threat to humanity and the planet. Pointing this out is not divisive, it is simply stating facts that require urgent attention. Also, on my channel here, I have stated that reality is stupid, and I've made a lot of broad assertions about how crazy and insane and ridiculous all this is. And I could go on giving examples to support those statements, and this would be one of them. Anyway, take care. Talk to you again soon. All the best. Bye.